all of our class meetings. And that way, in the event that you can't make it to class, then you always have this to refer to if you're reviewing, okay? Before we go into what I want to talk about today, is there anything that's come up in the last few days where you're wondering, well, you know, I had a chance to look at the syllabus, or I had a chance to look at the Moodle site, and this doesn't make sense to me? Anything like that?
I noticed that last week when I looked at the Moodle site, some of there were links to exercises and stuff, and then I can't see any of those now. Am I getting that wrong, or?
No, it's just that when I revise those, I sometimes leave them open to remind me, go back, look at those, review them, but I never leave those visible until it's just about time to do them, because I don't want you thinking about exercises.
Okay.
I want you just thinking about the material. So that's why sometimes something will pop up. I'll leave it up for an hour or a day or whatever because I've got something else I've got to do. And then I'll come back, I'll give it one more look, and then I'll make it invisible. I'll hide it. I'm not trying to be sneaky. It's just that I really don't like the idea of, you know, sort of teaching to the test or teaching to the quiz or something like that. I want there to be more of an encouragement to just get a general grasp of the material. So if you, Owen or anybody else, if you see that, that's what I'm doing. You know, I'm not trying to fake you out.
Okay.
You know, I mean, I suppose I could if I wanted to. I mean, it's my class, right? I could do anything I want. I've already been paid, you know.
That's true.
I just, you know, I was in my international studies class right before it started. I was talking to somebody, and I was telling him, I was like, you know, you have no idea what a great way to make a living this is. And I almost felt guilty about it because so many people I know have such crappy jobs. And I was talking to somebody who, back in the day, used to dig ditches with me when we were both about 18. And I was like, you know, I wasn't sleeping that good last night. And he was like, oh, is something on your mind? I said, no, I was just really looking forward to Monday. And there was this long pause. He's like, what? I said, no, man, I get to teach. I really dig it. He's like, oh, you're weird, man. So, well, you've known me for 40 years. Of course I'm weird, you know. But, all right, I'm sorry. A couple of new people have come in here. I just want to make sure that you, there's one I missed. I want to make sure everyone gets credit for being here. Okay. All right. All right, is there anything else? Any other questions like Owen's in terms of, well, the architecture of the class is puzzling me or something doesn't make sense? If there is, that's okay. You know, that's fine. Otherwise, we can jump in and get going. Okay. The focus for today is this concept of institutions. And so what I want you to do is, at some point, I want you to take a look at those notes that I've linked on the Moodle page. And those should be visible, unlike the hidden exercises that are there to trick you and make you feel foolish. This is really, if there's a perspective for this class, a sort of, okay, we're going to frame this way, which every class does, whether they admit it or not. The framework is institution. It's called institutionalism. That is, you can understand a lot about human behavior, and you can go a long way down the road toward predicting human behavior if you understand what they accept as routine or regular behavior. That is, it's been institutionalized. Okay, so just so there's no confusion, for purposes of this class and the materials we're dealing with, when I say institution, I'm not talking about a building or a place, okay? I think a lot of people, when I ask them to define institution, they'll say, well, a hospital, but they're thinking the building instead of, no, you know that Red Cross? That's the sign of an institution. In other words, we know enough to know, not just in the United States, but in most parts of the world, right? That cross doesn't mean necessarily, oh, there's a church. It means there's somewhere where I can get medical assistance. And the reason we know that is because we've seen it repeatedly. And we associate that Red Cross, or in some cultures it's a Green Cross. We associate that with medical assistance or emergency assistance. It's like when you see, even if you didn't read, you're driving in your car in the United States and you see that sign that's a red octagon, okay? And you know, okay, that's that 8, I mean, I gotta stop, okay? The idea is that's part of the institutional assumptions that we have about how to drive safely in the United States. We drive on the right-hand side of the road. we stop at stop signs. We learn how traffic lights work, and we learn that red means stop and green means go, and of course yellow means hurry up and go faster so you can sneak through a light. So we learn all these things about institutions, and so what we're doing is when we study them, we're studying essentially two things. One of them is, well, how does this thing function? What does it do? How do we know it when we see it? And that's its nature. I refer to it in the notes as the nature of an institution. Okay, it looks like this. It compels us to behave in this way. All right. So like a stop sign compels us to stop. Okay, but it doesn't mean we have to stop, get out of our car, and go away. It means we have to stop, and then beyond a certain point, we're allowed to go forward again. A traffic light, same thing. Language is a symbolic set of reference, right? In other words, we use language because I want to know what's inside your head, and you want to know what's inside my head. We have to have a way of making that mutually comprehensible. So we use language. That's an institution. That's in the sense that I mean institutions. So the nature of it is essentially the architecture of it. What are the moving parts of it? What are the things we look at and we know, oh, see, look, that's what that is. That's a sign, and that sign says exit, or that sign says danger, or that sign says stop, or whatever it says, okay? That's its nature. That's how we know it. The second part of an institution, though, is its function, okay? In other words, why do we have to have a stop sign? Why we're adults, right? Can't we be trusted to know when to stop? I'm asking you.
Not always.
Why not? We're grown up. We sit in our chair, or my feet are touching the floor, I'm a scale model of a big boy. Don't I know better? I know when to stop.
Others probably don't.
Well, do we know whether or not they do?
No.
We don't. And so what do we do in order to not have to rely on other people's skill and judgment?
Set up some kind of institution, like a pattern of behavior that's agreed on.
Exactly. So that's why we do it, because it isn't that we're saying, oh, everyone is stupid as soon as they get in a car, even though that's probably kind of true. What we're saying is there's every reason for you not to know that you need to stop here. Okay. Now, maybe you need to stop until we tell you you can go. So we're going to put a traffic light there. Or it used to be, you very seldom see this, but it used to be in cities common, there'd actually be a police officer standing out there directing traffic. How many of you have ever actually seen that except in an emergency? It used to be common if you went to a big city. You would see, like if you went to New York or parts of San Francisco, you'd see a police officer directing traffic. We don't do that anymore for a variety of reasons, okay? But it might be that we're thinking, no, we don't need a police officer out there, and we really don't even need a light, because there's not a lot of people going through there who need that to happen. So we're going to put a sign up. So whoever shows up is going to know, okay, when you see this sign, you have to stop. Then there are things you have to do. You have to look around. If somebody stops at the same time as you and they're to the right of you, under Oregon and California law at least, you let them go first and then you go. There's all these sort of rules of the road, okay? All right, so the nature of those is the sign or the habit. Drive on the right-hand side of the road. Yield to the person on the right at a four-way stop, whatever it is. The function is to avoid traffic tie-ups and accidents, okay? So does that distinction between nature and function make sense? Okay, then give me an example of another institution and give me its nature and then give me its function. Anybody? Because I don't want to talk anymore. I can hear myself talk anytime. I'm feeling peculiarly patient. Give me an institution and then tell me what's its nature, what does it look like, and then what's its function? Why is it there? How does it help?
You have political institutions like, we all pay taxes for.
Well, that's an economic institution.
Yeah.
But okay, all right, so taxation. All right, what does it look like?
Well, ideally, it would look like you're paying into services that you and the rest of the public would benefit from.
Well, we're not speaking theoretically. This is an actual existing institution. How is it done in the United States? Let's say, forget state taxes. Let's say federal taxes. How is that done for most of us, for just workers?
Just take it out of your paycheck.
That's right, but it wasn't always that way. So part of the institutional nature is we figured out that by withholding this money and allowing the government to hang on to it for a year, that's money the government has to spend, okay? And you sort of have to justify that you deserve to have some of that money or all of it given back to you, which would be what's called a tax return. In other words, what a tax return is, part of the nature of taxation is, given how much money you made in a year, how much you grossed, before taxes, that puts you in a certain status or bracket. And in that bracket, you're only supposed to pay this % of your income. And you paid more than that because we took it out of your check first. Okay. Now, do you always get back all of the taxes you paid?
No.
What are the taxes you're never going to get back, at least until you retire?
Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare stuff.
Yeah, Medicare and Social Security. Okay, those are insurance programs. Okay, what a lot of people think is, oh, those are welfare. No, they're not. They're not welfare programs. They're insurance programs. Social Security is a pension program to ensure that you at least are less likely than you might otherwise be to have to be poor when you can't work anymore. Okay, and so you pay into that and your employer matches that fund. And then when you're ready to retire, you can draw on that. And, so you'll get like a couple $1,000s a month or whatever the hell it is, depending on how much money you make. That's just, it's paying insurance. Okay. Medicare is the same thing. You're paying money out of the earnings that you make. And typically your employer will match those so that at the very time when you're most likely to need health care, the theory is you will be able to afford it when you really need it, okay? It isn't going to be free, okay? This isn't socialism because remember, you paid for this in a discrete account. You paid a certain amount of money in there. And so, yeah, it's like a health insurance policy. It does not cover all of the costs of healthcare. And as you will find out, when, the nuts and bolts of your body start to wear down, healthcare gets more expensive the older you get, unless, like me, you just don't care, And they're like, well, if it hurts, it hurts. I'm not going to pay money to have that stop hurting. I'm going to buy another guitar, because I care more about guitars than I do about pain. But so that's what it looks like. That's its nature. What's its function? Why is it there?
To serve as like sort of a security net.
Well, what do we do with taxes? We do a lot more than just Social Security and Medicare, although those are big parts of the budget.
Right.
What's
schools?
It pays to take care of things.
What's that?
It pays to take care of things like it pays for our roads. It pays for certain types of buildings, our schools,
Right.
A lot of public things, so public institutions, public roads, things like that. That's what taxes go to. I don't know necessarily in Oregon, so don't pay state tax or income tax, but everywhere else, like I used to live in Illinois, and the taxes go to fix the highways every year because the highways are total crap there.
Well, the highways, anything that's federal, for example, is paid with federal highway funds. Okay, but if you have state roads, right, then those are going to be supported with state taxes of some kind. Your schools are not typically paid for by federal income taxes. They're paid for by local taxes, usually property taxes. And so the idea is it's what's called economic redistribution. That is, we're going to take money from everybody and then we're going to redistribute it to the public good. So that, as individuals, you couldn't afford to pay to build a school. Well, but if the whole community kicks in some money, and then maybe the state has an educational fund that helps subsidize that, and there may be a little money from the Department of Education of the United States government, suddenly you can either have a new school or you can have improvements made to your school or whatever it is. It's stuff that we can't afford to do as individuals that can only be done by expenditures of public revenues gathered from the public for the use of the public. That's the idea. Now, a lot of people say, oh, it doesn't work that way. Well, if you, for example, what happens if you don't want the United States to have such a large military, and you don't want the United States to be involved in global military projection of force? Can you just withhold that part of your taxes? Well, why not?
Because that's been agreed upon, that, you know, you could vote to change legislature for that stuff.
Okay, but nobody asked me. Nobody
Right.
came to me, knocked on the door and said, hey, Bill, you understand, right? You agree with us that you can't withhold any percentage of your taxes that would go to the Pentagon. So when you say, well, we agree on that, I'm not sure that we do.
Well,
why
the
is it-
institution itself
That's
of
right.
paying taxes, yeah.
Exactly. In other words, the institution doesn't allow us to have individual discretion over how that money is spent. That's what Owen was talking about, that the general agreement is this money is going to go into a kind of big fund or a couple of different funds. Now, one of them is going to be what is sometimes referred to as a lockbox, and that's Social Security. Now, the theory is that money in Social Security you can't use for anything else. Except we do know that it was one of the ways that we offset the cost of war, starting with Vietnam, was that we would actually buy treasury bonds and things like that. The theory was we're going to buy treasury bonds with the money from Social Security. Okay, that it's a very confusing model. There are different theories on how that actually works or doesn't work or anything like that. But theoretically, that's all that can be used for, is that sort of retirement insurance for Americans when they can't work anymore. Same thing with Medicare. In other words, you're not supposed to be able to go into Medicare and take money out and then give that to the police or give that to the military or give it to Social Security. It's just supposed to be for Medicare, okay? So the agreement is, okay, this is what we're going to do. We give up the individual right to decide how that money's spent. And we agree to be bound by law, like everyone else theoretically is, to pay into that proportionate to what we can afford, you know, as a percentage of our income. And beyond that, as Owen suggested, there's no other agreement. We don't have any more control. And for us to have to exercise that control, we would have to find a way to change the institution. Okay. All right, give me another one.
Another example of an institution.
Yeah.
Would like the police force be one?
Are you asking or telling?
Asking really. I don't really know, but
Well,
is it?
given the way we've defined an institution. Okay, your grade is on the line now, Ross. You're either going to fail this class or not right now. Would you consider the police force to be an institution?
This is why I was asking.
But see, we have to learn to take a stand. And you're learning right now. Does it have a nature and a function? Is it some sort of accepted behavior that everyone more or less follows? Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Okay.
No, again, we're not saying that institutions are perfect or that they always work the way they're designed. I mean, Owen, gave us the example of taxation. We know that, when we hear this morning, for example, that Donald Trump last year and the year before paid $750 in taxes, it's like, that doesn't sound like that's working. That doesn't. I paid a lot more than that. Okay. So we're not saying, is the police force a good institution or a functioning institution? Is it an institution?
Yes.
Yes, it is. And it is because we can identify it as some agreed upon, recognizable set of recurring behaviors that indicates to us this is how we're supposed to behave. It's part of the enforcement structure of law, right? And so Ross is right. Of course it's an institution. It is also, beyond being an institution, it's what's called a public institution. It's not a private institution. In this class, all we're really interested in are public institutions because we're interested in studying politics. And if politics is the process of public decision-making, for example, as Ross implies, right, with the police. Well, who's going to pay for this? How are we going to support this institution? We've agreed we're going to take some of our tax dollars that Owen was talking about, and we're going to allow those to be spent to equip a police force that's supposed to take care of us and protect us. Now, does it always take care of us and protect us? Clearly, it does not always do that. But that's what it's intended to. So its nature is, you have people who are trained specifically in general notions of law and law enforcement, and unfortunately, increasingly are trained in military tactics, which really started with Ronald Reagan's war on drugs, where we began to militarize the police in terms of the kinds of training that we gave them and the kind of hardware with which we equipped them. I'm old enough to have remembered the police before SWAT teams existed. The first SWAT teams were created in Los Angeles for hostage situations. They were created and deployed first in 1969. And the idea was and it was emphatic, the only reason you would ever unleash this kind of force against a civilian population would be in a dire social emergency, like a hostage crisis where people had been taken captive and were being held against their will, and there was a threat that they were going to be killed if something, did or did not happen. Okay, we now use SWAT teams to do things like bust into your house and see if you have pot or meth. We can. By the way, just, to put that in perspective, on average, we have at least on average once a day where an armed team on a no-knock warrant breaks into the wrong house in search of drugs. The average is about one a day, sometimes more, okay? So maybe this, Ross, might have been what confused you. I wasn't trying to suggest, is this a well-functioning institution? But is it an institution that has a defined public purpose, that is subsidized by the public, and that has a certain architecture to it? Now we usually associate it with uniforms, and increasingly we associate it with military or paramilitary hardware. When you look at the police on the news now, you would think that you were in a place that had federalized the police forces as soldiers a lot of times. It's hard for you to realize that most of my life, the police did not dress like soldiers, okay, and didn't use all that firepower that you see. If it got that bad, they called in the National Guard. Okay, now the police do it. But yeah, that would be a public institution. The idea is we've agreed that we're going to have this institutional structure of a code of behavior that we're going to call law, okay? And we're going to agree to be bound by it, because if we're not, we have to leave. Okay, if you're not going to be bound by Oregon state law, let's say that like pot was still illegal in Oregon, okay? But let's say it was legal in California, even though we sort of beat them to it. You'd have to understand, well, if I'm in Oregon, I can't have pot. If I'm in California, I can. And that's the law, and I have to be aware of that, okay? If you're not, you're subject to the law. And the theory is everyone is supposed to be equal under the law, okay? That is, anybody breaks the law, that it doesn't matter who they are, they're subject to some sort of sanction or punishment. And we know in real life it doesn't work that way, okay? But that's the theory. And so when we talk about institutions, okay, think about, what does it look like? What's its architecture? What are the parts of it that we recognize? With the police, again, it might be those flashing lights on a car. It might be the logo of the police force, or the little servant protect, or whatever is there. We will kill you if we want to, whatever it is. It might be uniforms. It might be firepower. Because if you go to London, for example, I haven't been to London in a while. One of the first things you'll notice is you will very seldom see a police officer with a weapon, other than a truncheon. Very seldom. Okay.
It's not like that anymore. They carry guns now.
No, they don't. Most of them
Last
still
time
don't.
I went there, they had guns.
It doesn't matter. Most of them don't. Most of them don't, is what I'm saying. It's considered unusual. Most police officers still have to check out a weapon. Now, what they've done, though, this has been their response to terrorism. First from the IRA, and then later from the kinds of terrorism that Americans think they're familiar with, is that they've deployed new forces that have weapons. But the regular cop on the beat doesn't typically carry a gun. Okay, that's still unusual. But they're more heavily armed than they were 10 years ago. There's no question of that. And still, in comparison to American police forces, they're scantily armed. They don't have anything like the kind of firepower that we have. Unless, again, they go to the British equivalent of a SWAT team. Those are paramilitary units. They're designed that way. Those were designed by people, not only people with law enforcement training, but people with military training. But there are other places you go where the police are routinely heavily armed. If you went to Mexico in the 60s or 70s, you have federal police. They're like soldiers. When I was in Nigeria in 1989, or when I wasn't supposed to be, which was Ghana in that time, the soldiers ran the country. It was a military dictatorship. And they didn't think anything at all of, they'd stop you at a checkpoint. The soldiers would stop you. And if they'd see, clearly there's a European, white guy, American, whatever, we need to have some money. And they'd shake you down. Because the alternative was they'd take you out, shoot you, cut your head off, and you disappear. Because they could do it. Okay. Because the rule of law wasn't really what that was about. It was just about keeping order. Okay. That's what's known as a police state. That is where the force of repression is used simply to protect the leadership, not to protect the people, but to protect leadership from the people. That's a police state. So if those of you are thinking, oh, we live in a police state, not yet, not yet. We might or might not be going in that direction. A lot of that's going to depend on your generation, but no, we do not live in a police state. And again, that's a sliding scale. But again, that's a different institutional arrangement of power where people, however reluctantly, come to accept my life isn't worth 5 cents if the police want it. Okay, you don't yet live in that country, but there are parts of this country where we know you do. Okay, particularly if you're a person of color, and most particularly if you're a person of color and or you are poor. Your life is valued less. There's no question of that. Okay, that has been very deeply institutionalized. Is racism an institution?
No, it's not an institution.
Okay, first of all, who said no?
I did.
Andrew?
Yeah.
Okay, explain to me why it's not.
I think it's more of a cause than an institution. It's more of a belief than anything.
Well, wait a minute. Okay. In other words, I guess it depends on what you mean by racism. When you hear the word racism and somebody asks you to define it, how would you define it?
Well, I guess and nowadays I think of like the Black Lives Matter movement. And
okay, I'm not asking for an example. I'm asking how you would define it as a concept.
I would define it as a concept, unfair treatment to a certain group of people based on their skin color.
Okay, normally when people think of racism, they go beyond that. The idea of racism as opposed to bigotry, what you're defining is kind of bigotry. Okay, the idea of racism is that the power arrangement of a society is going to be determined in part on the race of the people in that society. That's when people say structural or institutional racism, that's what they're talking about. That is, where you have, as you had for much of my lifetime, right? You had legal segregation. When I was a kid, you had legal segregation. That was institutional racism. Okay. Now, we don't have legal racism in that obvious form anymore. Okay.
But we still enforce policies that are rooted in, race.
What, like what?
Like the war on drugs, for one, redlining, too.
Well, the war on drugs was not really based on race. In other words, the war on drugs was not an attempt, there's no evidence that the war on drugs was undertaken by people who wanted to demonize poor people or demonize people of color or lock them up.
That. Yeah, I mean, there was that quote from, I can't remember who it was, the guy who worked with Nixon's administration, who said, did an interview years later about how, a lot of it was sort of a guise to go after, people that were against the war,
Again, that's not race. That's not race.
Or, right, true. Or
remember
people of color.
that most of the people who were against the war were white. It was the white middle class. When the white middle class turned against the war, it became problematic. Prior to that, it wasn't. And so when we get into something like racism, it's a tougher call to determine to what extent we might say is that institutionalized. If it's built into your system and it's accepted as a predicate of your society, it's become institutionalized. Okay, for example, I teach a media class, and one of the things that I used to do was an analysis of media coverage, and there were several good studies in this, and looking at the different ways in which people's success was explained by sports reporters. And there were a number of studies that showed that overwhelmingly, the athletic success of white athletes overwhelmingly was explained as a consequence of toughness, intelligence, and hard work. Whereas the athletic success of African-American counterparts was natural ability. But see, that reinforces stereotypes, and it articulates stereotypes that at that time were deeply embedded in the American middle class. And remember, I'm not talking about the 50s. I'm talking about the 90s and the early 2000s. That was still the norm. That's only recently changed. So it begs the question, Andrew's got a good point in that, you know, bigotry isn't really an institution. Bigotry is an individual behavior. Racism is a kind of collective value that somehow one race is or is not superior or inferior to another. The expectation that that is so, to the degree that you have it in a society, that is racism. That is institutional racism. And it isn't just a question of, well, yeah, white people are racist and nobody else is. It depends on who's in power, if you want to talk about institutional racism. Does that make sense? So in the United States, we're still a white majority country, although not for much longer. And so when you look at the power structure, it's dominated by white people, okay? Most white people are not interested in realigning the terms of order to the disadvantage of white people. Nor would anyone else be if they were in power, okay? And so what happens, whether people intend it or not, people will either create, reinforce, or powerfully imply that a certain social hierarchy exists. A majority of Americans, okay, depending on how the question is framed, are not uncomfortable with racial profiling, okay, if they're white. If they're not white, they're overwhelmingly hostile to it because they're overwhelmingly likely to be the victims of it, okay? That would suggest that there's an element of persistent racism in the terms of order of the United States. Okay, it's not an indictment. It's not like we're saying, oh, white Americans are evil and everyone else is a victim. That's racism in itself. What you're implying is, well, people of color are nothing more than victims with that kind of perspective. No, sorry, it's a lot deeper than that. Okay, now these kind of discussions, I notice everybody getting real quiet and kind of looking away from the camera, and I don't want to get drawn into this. This is the kind of stuff, though, that is at the base of the terms of order of any society. And to some extent, it always has been. It isn't always race. Sometimes it's sex. Sometimes it's wealth. But you know, if we're going to talk about the institutional bedrock of a society, we can't just talk about the sort of formal institutions of government. And that's why I would ask a question, you know, like, well, would there be circumstances under which we consider racism institutional? Okay. People argue over it. Not everybody agrees with it, but it is much more than merely a belief, okay? That's bigotry. If as an individual you believe that, you know, white people are superior or something like that, that's an individual belief. Now, that doesn't mean you as an individual made that all up by yourself. That's where we get into this notion of culture. And so if you're in the notes and you go just beyond institutional discussions, we get into culture, okay? And you get into looking at two elements of culture that I want you to think about, both of which are related to what we're talking about. And they reinforce social institutions. One of them is what I refer to here as cognitive biases, and the other is social relations, okay? Now, when I say cognitive biases, what that means is predispositions in the way we think, okay? Some people, all right, when they get to this point and they're trying to teach the concept of culture, will refer to this as values, okay? The term values, I think, is insufficiently explanatory. It doesn't have a lot of power. The notion of a cognitive bias concedes that every one of us is constrained in our thinking at any given time, that no one's mind is ever completely open, nor can it be. Okay, you know, it's interesting in my international studies class, you know, we had a really interesting discussion about at what point do you tolerate other people's belief systems, even if they're very different from your own. And that's not an easy question to answer. And the thing is, the closer you get to the consequences of those belief systems, if you disagree with them, the more likely you are to oppose them. That's because they can't be reconciled because of your own cognitive biases. If, for example, you are a Catholic, okay, you're a practicing Catholic, and someone talks about, family planning or Planned Parenthood or something like that, okay, you're more likely in 2020 America just reflexively to oppose that. No, that's every human life is sacred, and there's no reason why that should ever be allowed, okay? But if you didn't grow up that way, if you're in, let's say, a different subculture that's maybe less religious, more secular, and you understand that there might be reasons where women ought to have that right to make that decision themselves as part of their control over their own bodies. You see how that's a very different way of looking at the same phenomenon, yeah? But also, because the point of view is so different, those differences are almost irreconcilable. It's not really very realistic to think that you're going to find much of a meeting of the mind between those two kinds of people. And it's because, in part of what I'm referring to here is cognitive biases. You just don't see the world that way, and you don't know how to do it, and you don't think you should. Okay, so the question is, well, how did that happen? How did you get that way? It's not you as an individual. It's not. It's you as an individual being the sum total of the effects of all the social relations you've experienced in your life. You start with your family, then your immediate friends, your encounter with public institutions, the most powerful of which are the church and school, okay? Not necessarily in that order, but often in that order, okay? And depending on how you're oriented toward different social groups, whether you live in a society that's pretty, homogeneous, where everybody's white, or everybody's, Latino, everybody's, whatever, as opposed to a real mixed society, like the societies I grew up in as a kid. When I was living on the east side in San Jose, the neighborhoods I lived in some of them were minority white. And so you learned really quickly, you weren't pulling the strings in that neighborhood. And if you tried to pull that white privilege stuff, you were going to lose teeth, and you weren't going to get home, because you didn't run the streets. It wasn't up to you. And so you're compelled to adapt to that. Now, one of two things can happen to you in an environment where you are the minority. One is you learn to understand, and maybe to some extent appreciate and value, the perspective of people not like you. But the other response to that is, and I saw this happen in both ways with my friends and even some of my family, you become a racist. You become a bigot because you get tired of being pushed, and you blame the fact of your being pushed on people being evil rather than, well, no. I mean, these are people who in this country, in this state, California, have been pushed, have been marginalized, and they've had enough, and they're going to push back. Why? Because there's a critical mass of them. There are enough of them that they can do it and feel safe, and they're going to get back some of theirs. It doesn't make it right. It makes it a fact, okay? So when you talk about, well, everyone should just keep an open mind. No one has an open mind. No one. None of you has an open mind. Every one of you has limits to how far your mind can go. I'm not talking about intelligence. I'm just talking about your ability to stretch your perspective, to meaningfully to accommodate beliefs, practices, institutions, behaviors that are very different from and even antithetical to yours, hostile to your view of the world. And the one example I used, one of the students was trying to explain how we should learn to respect everyone's beliefs. And I said, well, what about Nazis? Should we respect their beliefs? I mean, we know they exist. Should we respect their beliefs?
No.
Why not?
I don't know. They're inherently bad. We have to think of something on at least all beliefs on at least one even plane, and Nazis are just bad.
But are all beliefs on an even plane? The whole concept of cognitive biases suggests no, they're not. They can't be on an even plane. The very fact, Ross, and this is not an indictment, this is just an observation, that immediately when you hear Nazi, it just bounces off your brain. It's like, there's no way any of that can be justified. Again, what I'm not asking is, should we agree with those views? What I'm asking is, should we respect them? not agree
So
with them.
I would say, like, on a democratic, like our government perspective, with especially freedom of speech, we should allow that. Like, we kind of have to, not like we might not want to, but it's important to allow all beliefs to be said and heard.
Well, not all beliefs. For example, it's a crime to advocate the violent overthrow of the government.
Okay,
That's a
true.
crime.
But yeah,
But Jason, you go ahead with that. I didn't mean, I'm just refining rather than negating.
yeah, no, I get it.
You're making a good point. For example, Nazis, white supremacists, black nationalists, whatever, Afrocentrists, they all have a legal right to articulate their views. We are compelled to find a way to tolerate that articulation. Okay, I think your views are garbage, but if I'm going to be allowed to express my views and none of us is advocating violence, you got to be allowed to express your views. I would remind you that the American Civil Liberties Union, which most people think of as this left-wing organization, okay, the American Civil Liberties Union has on more than one occasion gone to court to guarantee the right of Nazis and the Klan to march in public and advocate their views. For the very reason that Jason suggests. Because if any of us have that right proscribed, we all lose it. That's the theory of the ACLU anyway. In other words, that's not a left-wing organization. It's a civil liberties organization, okay? But Ross brings up a good point, though. And I think a lot of you are probably thinking it, yeah, but Bill, these are Nazis. I mean, my God. Yeah? What does that mean to be a Nazi? Oh, come on, don't be afraid. I mean, come on. This is as safe a space as you're going to find.
In the context of talking about Nazi Germany, people who subscribed to a certain ideology.
What was the
political party,
ideology? What was it?
that someone from a different sect or race or was lower than you or was causing problems in your society and
Well, see, the thing
didn't
about
deserve the same.
the Nazis were about a lot more than that, and some of it was in some ways even creepier, okay? The German Nazi Party, the National Socialist Party, okay, involved in many ways, right? The Nazi Party itself was split over whether or not to accept the views of Christians and Christianity as legitimate, okay? What we see now is a lot of people who identify themselves as white supremacists or white nationalists outside of the United States often reject the Christian church. This is especially the case in the Scandinavian countries. I mentioned this, I think, in my IS 250 class. There was a buddy of mine years ago who was a music journalist, and he was into metal. He was really kind of into metal, and he went to Sweden and then went to Norway. He was just trying to do the Scandinavian metal scene in the 90s, and he encountered this whole like black metal, death metal thing in and around Oslo in Norway, and he was absolutely stunned to find out these people are a bunch of Nazis. They're anti-Christian, and they're anti-immigrant. They're not tolerant of homosexuality or any alternative sexuality. And it's like, well, I can't figure out why. And then he figured out why. Because their idea was that Christianity as a religion and as a culture had colonized them and destroyed their traditional identity as like Vikings and stuff. And they were trying to recapture that. They wanted their values and their culture back. And they felt that those things had been taken away from them. Well, here's the problem. They kind of had been. They had. When you lose the war, things are taken away from you. And that had happened. And so the surprise was that it was a bunch of metalheads doing this. Until they found out that a couple of pretty prominent young musicians in this black metal scene were responsible for burning down a bunch of the stave churches in Norway. Christian churches. They were serious. They were going to do something about it. Now, those are radical views. Radical in the sense that they're getting to what they believe the root of the problem is. That Christianity destroyed their culture and colonized them and converted them by force to Christianity and disgraced and defiled all of their landmarks and all of their history was warped and destroyed. They're not wrong. In other words, it's not completely fair, but it's not historically inaccurate. Okay. So should we respect their views even if we deplore some of their behavior?
Yes.
Okay, the challenge is, how do you do that? Okay, so part of the notion of cognitive biases and social relations is, if you've grown up and you've been socialized that tolerance is a value, that it's valuable to tolerate views with which you disagree, you are compelled by that to at least respect, if you don't agree with, to respect and tolerate the expression of the views. It doesn't mean that you're going to tolerate the church burning or violence or anything else. In other words, when we're talking about ideas, we're not talking about behavior. But it would also mean you'd have to tolerate racists. You'd have to tolerate them and allow racist views to be expressed. How many of you are comfortable doing that?
That was the
Yeah, see, I mean, it's hard, isn't it? Because institutionally, culturally, you've been brought up, most of you, to really be disgusted by racism. And,
To what extent do you tolerate intolerance? You know, how far?
well, see, that's the challenge. You're a step ahead of me, is that, do you tolerate intolerance? Well, it depends. Do you have a First Amendment that guarantees the expression of that short of advocating violence? Yeah, you do. That's the social contract. When we get into John Locke and things like that later on, we'll talk about that. But, you know, we do kind of have a tacit agreement that Americans have the right to shoot their mouths off as long as they don't yell fire in a crowded theater or advocate violence. They pretty much do. They pretty much do. What does that do, though, to a recent institution like cancel culture? What does that tell us about that? What is cancel culture? Oh, come on, this one's right in your ballpark.
Cancel culture would be, I guess, trying to punish somebody for their views, for expressing their views. That could be like in a workplace, by getting fired, or a boycott or something like that. Okay.
And again, you know, we can understand why people might be really disgusted with someone who has views that we look at as Paleolithic or, you know, repellent in some way. But how far do we want to go down that road of saying, well, if someone expresses themselves in a way that I find offensive, they ought to be punished? Is that fair?
Definitely not, in my view.
Now, again, you understand, that's not the same thing as saying, oh, that's okay, you know, boys will be boys, or bigots will be bigots, or whatever. We're not saying that. What we're saying is, okay, if you say something that people find repellent, they have every right, say you are an entertainer, they have every right to boycott your entertainment, right? To boycott, to do what they can to affect your ability to earn a living. They can do that. That's fine. Because it's voluntary. It's them making a choice. Now, sorry, I can't cross that line. You know, I hear this expression, I hear the use of this kind of language, the articulation of these ideas. I can't get with that. I mean, I remember encountering some musicians who I really admired and finding out that a couple of them were just absolutely repellent human beings. And it was like, I can't, every time I hear that music now, I don't hear the music anymore, I hear those views. And I don't know if I should even do this. Maybe I shouldn't. Nah, I don't think I will. But there's an actor whose work I really used to respect, whose work I cannot look at now, because I found out, you know, what he is and what his views are and what his behavior is, more importantly. I mean, everybody's got views I don't agree with, you know. I don't usually care. But when it's backed up with behavior, that's when I think, no, I can't do it. It isn't that I'm trying to be tough. My brain, the biases inside my head won't allow me to go there, is what I'm trying to explain. We're all limited by that. All of it. It doesn't matter how much you've traveled or whatever. That might broaden your mind a little bit. Remember the old expression, travel broadens the mind? Yeah, somewhat. But there's also the traveler who always tries to take his or her country and views and values with them everywhere they go. The average American traveling overseas never gets any farther than 5 miles away from their hotel. That's not going to broaden your mind very much. It's not. The average American who travels does not speak the language where they're traveling and sees no reason why they should. That's not going to broaden your mind very much. And the idea is, if your cognitive biases reinforced by your social relations encourage you to think, well, I shouldn't have to do that. Where I'm going to go, everybody speaks English. That's really not the point. The point is that you've put yourself above other people, even in the place to which you're traveling, by saying, you accommodate me. I'm not going to make any effort to accommodate you. Okay? And there's a kind of entitlement in that. There really is. And a lot of us, even though we don't realize it, we do that. Every time you find yourself in a situation where you don't speak the language, and you don't even try, what you're doing is you're arrogating to yourself. This is a consequence of these cognitive biases reinforced by social relations. You're arrogating to yourself an authority to be superior to that. I don't have to try. I'm an American. We have nuclear weapons. We put people on the moon. Learn English. How often do you hear that now? The one you're starting to hear more and more, go back where you came from. When I was an undergraduate, I was taking courses from a professor who was publicly an avowed Marxist. And this was in the 1980s, and so that was still a little bit hot to do, a little risky. There was a a right-wing organization that was paying students to go into these classes and disrupt them. And I finally had enough and leaned over to the guy who was doing it. He happened to be sitting next to me, and I said, you and I are going to have a moment outside. And so we went outside, and all I was going to do is say, look, man, I waited a long time to be able to go to college. I was almost 30 when I went to college, and I just don't have time to listen. I don't have time to listen to your gibberish. And also I knew who he was. I knew that he was a member of the Somoza family and things like that, and that his connections were to a dictatorship that had been displaced, And right away, he gives me this, why don't you go back where you came from? Now, this is a guy who comes from Nicaragua telling me, why don't you go back where you came from? I'm hearing that more now. I'm starting to hear that again. That's sort of the ultimate intolerance. In other words, you're not welcome here anymore. You just overstayed your welcome. By expressing this view, you've just overstayed your welcome. But cancel culture is doing the same thing by saying, I don't care whatever good you've done. I don't care how much you've grown. I don't care if what you did was 20 years ago. You are done here. We are finished. Okay? It's the same kind of intolerance. It really is. And it doesn't matter whether or not anybody's intending it. We now know that, the hallmark of institutional tolerance is it considered an offense in the eye of the person being offended? It's not what did you intend, it's how was it received. So the risk we're running right now is that kind of moving in either direction along an ideological spectrum in the United States, we've seen a kind of growing intolerance among politically active people. The strange thing about that is, if you look at the survey research data on Americans, we are far more tolerant as a people than we were in the 1950s. We're more tolerant of communism. We're more tolerant of homosexuality. I mean, there used to be, that was the big one that just separated people out. We are still uncomfortable with people who are atheists. Americans still struggle with atheism a lot. But generally speaking, Americans are significantly more tolerant as a people. But when you look at American activists, there seems to be this, on both sides, out at the fringes, this growing sense of intolerance. Whether you call it cancel culture or racism or whatever you want to call it, okay? In an institutional framework, what that means is that both those sides are pushing to change existing institutions to their advantage, okay? And they want to do that by either changing people's beliefs or demonizing them. If I can't change your beliefs, and by the way, cognitively, you won't, then I'm going to make sure they're demonized. If you think that we should have open borders, or you think that we should encourage immigration because we've got negative birth rates in the United States and we need a young, skilled workforce, you know what? You're an idiot. In fact, beyond that, you're a traitor. We're starting to hear that. But on the other hand, we're also hearing people say things like, well, if you think that religion is important and this and this and this, then you're a fascist. Well, no, not really. But that's the way we sound to other people these days. The United States does not sound good to the rest of the world because we can't even agree on simple things. We can't even agree, and by the way, either can the Brits, on whether or not it's a good idea to wear a mask in a pandemic. Now, that's cowboy simple. That's as simple as it gets. That's not about free expression. No one has a constitutional right to put other people in danger. No one. Of course not. If we can't yell fire in a crowded theater, we can't go around spewing our mucus on people in a pandemic. It kind of follows. But you'd never know that when you look at the way people argue. It's pathetic. Part of that is what's happening fundamentally. This is where I'll wrap it up. Yeah, this is right. See, we've gone about an hour. What's being challenged here is not us as individuals. What's being challenged is the capacity of our institutions to guide our behavior, to help us understand what's expected of us. Because the primary function of institutions is please let me know what I'm supposed to do so that I don't harm anyone and I don't make an ass of myself, right? Let me have some ability to predict what's going to happen in the next 20 minutes or the next 5 days. Institutions are there to allow us to do that. Why? Because it reduces anxiety. Human beings are at their worst when they fall prey to their anxieties. We know this. So there's this important sort of psychological function of institutions. You know, I mean, everyone here understands English. Every once in a while, I might use a word with which you're not familiar, but for the most part, you know what I'm saying. No one's asking you to agree with it, but you know what I'm saying. And so there's relatively little anxiety. But all of a sudden we start talking about racism or cancel culture or something like that and everybody gets nervous. Okay. That's the challenge of institutions. I once referred to universities as an intellectual free fire zone. I was accused of advocating violence. Okay, let me help you with that one. We have a word in the social sciences for that. It's called stupid. Okay, that's just stupid. No one would think that I was advocating violence. But what happens when people do? What happens when people are kind of stupid and they're really not listening to you and they just want to shout you down? They're going to get away with it. Okay, and they're going to try and find an institution that's going to support them in it. The most supportive institution for this kind of growing sense of intolerance is the political parties, the two political parties. Because the leadership of both of our parties right now, particularly the Republicans, because they've just been, as a project, they have been bolder in declaring their principles. Democrats have been kind of craven in terms of saying, this is what we really stand for. But both political parties are starting to say, look, stand up and be who you are. Don't let the other side try to talk you into being something you're not, okay? Well, then you're going to have things clash. And the Republicans have just been, they've been more public about it. They've been more authoritative about it. And for most of the part, despite the fact that they're a minority party, they've controlled a great deal of government. And they've managed to, you know, imbue American institutions with that sense of, no, just be who you are, you know? And this is what the Reagan Revolution was about. Okay, and make no mistake, it was a revolution and it succeeded. And what it succeeded in doing was stopping a lot of what a lot of people saw as sort of destabilizing progress. Well, you're breaking down all these institutions, but you're not putting anything up there to replace them and stabilize society. You're breaking down segregation, but you're not telling us how we're supposed to react to that. You know, you create the Voting Rights Act, which says you're going to scrutinize these southern states and you're going to keep a special eye on those elections, but no other ones. Okay. And again, there are perfectly good reasons for that. But if you live in one of those states, you start thinking, why are you singling us out? Never mind what my grandfather did. That ain't me. So I think Republicans have been, we're generalizing, but Republicans as a national party have just been bolder at grabbing that culture ground and saying, this is us. This is who we are. Democrats have tried to be all things to all people because their primary concern has not been fixing the country. Their primary concern has been reestablishing themselves as what they have not been since 1970s, a majority party. The Republicans haven't been a majority party since the 1920s. They've had a longer wait, but they've exercised the cultural impact of a majority party in much of what they've been able to do. The reason for that is they have been a stronger, more coherent ideological party. what's called a programmatic party. The Democrats sort of abandoned that after Ronald Reagan. There's something called the Democratic Leadership Council. And what they decided is we've got to abandon all this welfare stuff and this civil rights stuff and stuff like we got to back off of that stuff because Republicans are beating us in elections, because white people are getting scared. I mean, this is fact on the ground. This isn't opinion. I mean, Republicans will tell you, if they're honest, they'll say, well, yeah, no, we decided this is what you have to do. Newt Gingrich, 1978. If you want to reestablish the Republican Party as a majority party, the first thing you have to do is teach them to hate their government because it's controlled by Democrats. And they did. It worked. They did it. That's a bold strategy. See what I mean by a bold strategy? They're like, no, this is scorched earth. We're not taking any prisoners here because it's too important. The liberals and the Democrats, they're going to run off with this progressive agenda, and everything we know as the United States is going to be gone. That's been the Republican mantra, since the 1980s. And they've been remarkably successful at it. They really have. So what I want you to think about with this notion of institutions is that there's going to be a lot you don't like. Just like in this class, I'm going to say things you just don't like. Remember that part of my job is to try and frame things to provoke a response, not to goad you, but to stimulate interest. And I'm not going to play with you with stuff, but I'm not going to pull any punches. That's not my job. My job is not to make you feel good. Certainly not to make you feel good about your personal beliefs, whatever they may be, because I really don't care what your personal beliefs are. Okay. What I want people to do is explore their own personal beliefs, try and figure out where those beliefs came from, and then ask themselves again, do these beliefs stand up? Are they really mine? Are they worthy of me? Or do I need to rethink things? I don't think you can do that unless you make a systematic study of how beliefs are formed. So that's what all this stuff about cultural biases and culture and institutions is about. Okay, are there any questions? All right, I'm going to remind you of something that I mentioned on the first day, apropos what I'm saying right now, which is this class is not for you as individuals, right? This class is a public institution. And so no one is here to advance personal views, including me. And so, if you feel like you're being put upon or something like that, I think the thing that you have to question is, because as soon as I started talking about cancel culture, I saw a few of you I saw your eyes go cold. It's like, well, you can't come after cancel culture because that's the good side. What I'm trying to suggest is I'm not interested in good sides and bad sides. I'm really not. I'm just trying to explain the sides and how they work and how they're institutionalized. So you got to figure. It's like, you know what? All he's asking me to do is listen. I don't have to agree with him. But if I don't listen, then it begs the question, what are you doing here? If I'm going to throw this stuff out and we're going to talk about it and you're just going to reject it, then why don't you take a different class? Really, I'm not telling anyone to leave, but it's like, look, I don't care about your personal views. And I don't care about what you agree with or don't agree with. There are things that I'm capable of teaching. Okay. But if you're going to get personal about it, then you should probably find another class. There are other ways to satisfy this particular requirement. I'm not interested in arguing anybody's individual views. That's really important because what then happens is we get these personal conflicts and everybody's got a personal agenda and then no one's teaching anything and no one's learning anything. Does that make sense? Okay, that's all I'm suggesting is to kind of keep that in mind. All right, anything else? Okay, then what I'd like you to do for the next class is, if you haven't already, obviously look at the notes on culture and the notes on institutions. Then what I'd like you to do is look at the discussion of how we distinguish between power and force, because that's linked to our assumptions about institutions. So in Wednesday's class, I'd like to talk about power and force. Okay? Anything else? All right, then I'll see you on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.